Hello students, in this video we're going to be using the monocentric model now to model a city with two income groups. So if you recall, urban economics is doing this modeling so that we can understand what are the factors that determine the city structure or the city performance. Check this out. Let's suppose there's two income levels, the poor and the rich. The poor have a lower Y income level and the rich have a higher income level, YR. That's the only difference between these two groups. And the results of this model will look very similar to what's happening in many cities in the United States.
Huge neighborhoods were built from scratch on the edge of town, and instead of a mix of uses, residential neighborhoods were completely separated from commercial buildings, requiring a car to get between them. This probably seems normal to most people living in the US or Canada today. Since the suburban experiment began, several generations of people have grown up not knowing anything different. I certainly didn't until I moved overseas.
This trend started in the 60s or even before then. No, in the 60s. And then it's still going on, but every time it's less the influence of this idea that the rich live in the suburbs and the poor live in downtown. Well, I can imagine that the economists in the 70s and 80s wanted to explain this phenomenon they were observing with their own eyes. So let's see what explains it according to this model. The different groups have different prices for housing, denoted by PP for the poor and PR for the rich. So these are the housing prices per square foot. When this happens, the members of the rich group are indifferent of living this far from the city core or this far from the city core, as long as this is the price of housing. Same thing for the poor. The poor are indifferent between paying this price near the core or this other price far away from the core along the blue line. Now, what explains these differences? What explains the difference is the effect of income on spatial structure. You remember that an increase in income means an increase in dwelling size. So an increase in income gives the household an incentive to move further from the core. I think this is easy to understand in this intersection. In this intersection, the distance is the same for the poor guy in the blue line and the rich guy in the red line. Over here, the poor is willing to pay more for the housing, and over here, the rich is willing to pay more for the housing. Therefore, here, the poor outbids the rich, and over here, the rich outbids the poor. But in this spot, they have the same distance. But if you recall from the original monocentric model, the rich have a bigger house, and the poor have a smaller house. And this makes all the difference. And you might recall that the slope at any given point is given by minus commuting cost divided by the square footage of the house. This comes from the derivative of P with respect to X when you solve for P from the budget constraint of the consumer. Given that this is the slope, let's put ourselves again in this equilibrium point. What's happening here? One explanation is that the house of the poor is smaller, so we have less square feet. Therefore, this number is bigger than this number. Let's think about it. The commuting cost is exactly the same. This argument goes like the transit fare is the same no matter your income, and the price of gasoline is the same no matter your income. So under these assumptions, you can say, okay, commuting cost divided by square footage will be bigger for the poor than commuting cost divided by square footage for the rich. The reason is that the rich have more square footage. And since that number is in the denominator, then the whole division is smaller than this number where the square footage is small, and therefore this number is bigger. Of course, this is in absolute terms. In other words, the rich have a flatter slope and the poor have a steeper slope. Another way to say this is that poor households can tolerate high per square foot housing over here better than the rich because their houses are small. And therefore, the poor are able to outbid the rich for housing in the center where P is high. While over here, the rich are willing to pay a little bit more because they have higher income, and the rich are able to outbid the poor over here where P is lower. However, the main assumption here is that the commuting cost is the same for the poor and the rich. Now, we're going to leave it as that, but you must recall from other classes, for example, in environmental economics, you would study a lot what the value of time is. If you recall, in a previous example, we talked about the value of time waiting in line to get a Starbucks coffee. When you are a successful economist who earns hundreds of dollars, it's very expensive to waste 10, 15, 20 minutes just in line waiting. And that's the reasoning behind this assumption. A proper analysis of commuting costs should include the time spent commuting. So the rich have higher wages, and the cost of commuting time then is more painful than for the poor who have lower wages. If you go outside of the US, you will find that the slums, the favelas, or the blight tend to be in the outskirts. Let me show you some pictures. This is Mumbai, and you can see right there the striking division between slums and the richer housing. This is Mexico City, the eastern part. You can see in the far, there are the buildings closer to downtown, and the rest of the city are low-rise buildings and further from the city. You won't believe which city is this. Maybe here's a clue. This is a little national flag. This is Paris. Paris has the same structure. Slums are located in the outskirts of the city. This is Bhubaneswar in Odisha. And this one is a slum in the outskirts of Seattle, Washington. So you see, there's other realities that need an explanation. So let's just talk about 3 explanations that are in the literature that correspond to these papers. Rappaport, Glaser, and Kahn give this explanation. You know what? The poor cannot afford cars. Therefore, they must live near the jobs or near transit options. They use all the data and they conclude that as long as you have more than one mode of transportation, then this is what's going to happen. Not in New York City, but yes, in the rest of the nation. Here we have another explanation by Bruckner and Rosenthal. They say, listen, the rich prefer newer houses. Now, new dwellings tended to be in the suburbs, so the rich lived in the suburbs. However, when the city's old buildings are remodeled or torn apart and build new ones, the rich go back to downtown. And this is when we experience gentrification. That is another explanation. Yet another one, again by Bruckner, Thies, and Zeno, is that amenities such as historical monuments, fine architecture, or natural amenities like being in the shore near the ocean bring the rich to the center. So if the center has all those things, the rich will go to downtown. You could write another paper with me arguing that also having better infrastructure in terms of bike lanes, coffee shops, very important parks, will bring more educated and richer people to the center. So, bottom line, this model, the monocentric model, originally only considers commuting costs T constant. But there are other costs from living in the suburbs, particularly the time commuting, that must be considered. Okay?